Good evening. Thank you very much for joining us here tonight. My name is Mohammed Sultan, and I am going to be your host and moderator for the evening. My kids are watching on Zoom at home, so hi kids. Just a brief introduction to myself. I'm an emergency physician. I work in Richmond Hospital, and I'm a clinical instructor at the School of Medicine here at UBC. So before we get started, I just wanted to acknowledge that we're all gathered here today on the traditional and ancestral and unceded territory of the Musqueam Nation. So I wanted to start off the ceremony by asking our elders Thelma and Arthur Stogan, to please come up and open the ceremony for us.
Good evening, my dear people. My English name is Thelma Stogan. I'm from the Musqueam Nation, which is not even 10 minutes down the road here. My ancestral name is Loch Liuch, which was handed down to me by my grandma on my mom's side. I want to welcome you all to the Musqueam unceded territory, or the unceded territory of the Musqueam Nation. All ceremonies and all gatherings that we have been going to are so important. And I was asking the young lady here what this is about, and I was asking my brother. With everything that's going on in today's world, I'm just going to ask the Creator, really kindly, we need peace. We really need peace. My late father, Vince Stogan, every time he was about to do ceremony or anything, we had a few people come up to us and ask us when we're doing ceremony, why are you doing ceremony for non-Aboriginal people? My late father's answer was, this one big sky is one ceiling. Doesn't matter about the color of our skin. As far as I know, we all bleed red. And so when anybody asks us to go out for help, especially when we're doing ceremony, burning ceremony for a lost loved one, somebody who just passed, we have a ceremony, what we call a burning ceremony. We send that loved one off in a good way. We'll send them with food and we'll send them with clothing. And we have also done this burning ceremony for other nationalities. And so I really want to welcome you all to our territory, and I hope that you get what you really need to thrive for in this gathering. Haichka, all my relations. I'm going to let my brother do a little bit of talking. Haichka.
Good evening, ladies and gentlemen. My name is Arthur Stogan Sr. I'm an elder from the Musqueam First Nations, which is about 3 miles east of us here. This is we're here this evening to welcome each and every one of you into the traditional territory of the Musqueam, Squamish, and Tsewatu shared lands. It's very important that, we travel so much to welcome people into our territory. And it's such an honor, especially for the staff that hired us to come down and do this. Before we leave, I always ask the mighty Creator to put his hand upon each and every one of you so that you make it home to your loved ones at the end of the evening. So I raise my hands in our way of saying thank you, welcome, Haichka Siyem and Siyaya in our language, which means thank you very much, as it's such an honor for us to be here this evening as Musqueam elders. Haichka Siyem and Siyaya, Haichka.
Thank you very much to our elders. So before we bring our speakers to stage, I just wanted to give you guys a brief overview of our organization, BC Physicians Against Genocide. So we are a group of BC physicians who work here. We are committed to our communities here. We teach at the medical school here. And we got together because we're against genocide. And the name of this group is almost laughable because we've been through medical school and we all took the Hippocratic Oath. Do you really need a special focus group for a bunch of physicians who are against genocide? And the painful truth is that we did. Because when this genocide started 2 years ago, and we approached the organizations that were supposed to represent us, the organizations to whom we would pay our dues. So we went to the Canadian Medical Association, and they basically told us that, it's complicated. We don't want to get involved. We just don't take sides in politics. So we're just going to stay silent, and we're going to allow things to maintain at status quo. And 2 years later, what has been the result of staying silent in the face of injustice? Well, out of the 36 hospitals that were standing in Gaza before October 7th, 18 of them have been completely demolished. And there is no single fully functioning hospital in the entire Gaza Strip. 2 years of silence and not taking action has resulted in at least 8% of Gaza's population completely dead. We have seen on social media and even on legacy news outlets, ambulances being ambushed and destroyed, healthcare workers being targeted. The United Nations Satellite Imagery Program has estimated that of all of the standing structures in Gaza, approximately 78% have either been completely demolished or partially destroyed. And the result of that, if to just put that into context with numbers, that's 100,000 buildings that are destroyed, 100,000 metric tons of bombs, which is the equivalent of 7 Hiroshima-sized nuclear bombs dropped in Gaza. And all of the Gaza Strip would fit in the lower mainland here. So that is the degree of destruction that we are seeing. On top of that, we are seeing famine, a man-made famine. And the World Health Organization and the UN partners recently put this classification out that a famine is occurring. And this is no small label to put, because in order to qualify for a famine, not only do you have to have extreme food shortage, but you need to have acute malnutrition, and you need to have starvation-related deaths. So all 3 of these thresholds have been breached, and so we can say confidently that there's a famine happening there. So we have destruction of healthcare, destruction of infrastructure, we have famine, we have journalists that are not allowed to enter Gaza. International journalists have been banned. So the only people that are reporting in Gaza are the locals, and they themselves don't have any protection. They themselves are starving. They themselves are watching their own family members getting killed. On video, they are carrying the bodies of their children, and on video, they are praying over the bodies of their loved ones while they're continuing to report, but they continue to get targeted. This is the result of being completely silent and not taking action and hiding behind this lie of it's complicated and just letting things stay at status quo. And so, as a physician and as a faculty member here, and as a human being, as a father, I am so ashamed to say that the Canadian Medical Association does not represent me. And it does not represent so many other physicians. And because they don't represent us, and because they don't speak for us, that is why we are here to represent ourselves, and we are here to speak for ourselves, and this is why we exist as an organization. So I want to start the presentations. Just a little disclaimer. What you're about to hear is very painful. So if you need a minute to step outside, there are going to be support persons in the back to help you. This is very heavy on your heart. Feel free to step out if you need to. Our first speaker is Dr. Deirdre Nunan. She's an orthopedic surgeon, Canadian trained. She did her med school here at UBC. And she has been on many humanitarian missions across the world and has spent the last 2 years in Gaza. She just got back in July. She was working at Nasser Hospital in Khan Younis. And so I want to invite her up to share her experiences and her stories from her recent trip to Gaza.
Thank you so much. Am I close enough here? All right. I just want to clarify, my CV is a mess, and so it's easy to get wires crossed. I have not been in Gaza for the past 2 years, but I have been in Gaza over a period of 2 years, spread through 6 different occasions from 2019 to now. In the last year, I was in Gaza on 3 different occasions. I was there for 4 weeks last October. I was there for 7 weeks in the springtime. And most recently, I was back in July for 3 weeks. And I left Gaza the most recently on the 27th of July. So it's primarily that period of time that I will draw from, but with a little bit of reference to some of the previous experiences that I have had in Gaza. And I will just say that there are some photos. One photo that is a bit graphic. It is blurred, and there are a few slides where there just simply is no photo. That there are some things that cannot be or should not be expressed visually. But otherwise, this is what we've called my health report from Gaza. So the last time that I was here in Vancouver, invited by BC Physicians Against Genocide to speak, the lecture that I gave was 2 days after this, after my hospital was attacked by multiple Israeli airstrikes. So surrounded by those plumes of smoke and dust and ash, that is the European Gaza Hospital. This is May 13th, 2025, and I had left the hospital less than 1 month before. And this time I'm here in Vancouver 2 weeks after my hospital was attacked. Israeli missiles were fired at the top floor of the hospital in a double tap strike that killed 22 people and injured 50 more. This is Nasser Medical Complex, because of course I could not go back to European Gaza Hospital after it was attacked and forced to close. This attack was on August the 25th of 2025. And as I said, I had worked there until July 27th. I can't tell you what it is like to be inside a hospital when it's attacked, because thankfully that has not happened in my life. And although I have had all too many experiences now where I have been outside a hospital that's been attacked, but it's been a hospital that I know well, and a hospital that's full of my colleagues, that sometimes still has my patients in its inpatient beds, I find myself completely unable to put those emotions into words or even really explain to myself what I feel. But what I can tell you is what it feels like to be in a hospital that's under threat of attack. And so that's what I will tell you about today, is that experience which I lived together with all of my colleagues in Nasser Hospital for a several-day period near the beginning of July. I'm going to tell you about July 10th of this year. It was just 1 week after I'd arrived back in Gaza the most recent time, and I'm going to try to recreate that day for you, and this is based on what I wrote at the time, the photos that I took, the messages that I sent and I received. So on July the 10th, I woke up to the sound of bombing. and to my roommates quietly getting ready for the day. And when we looked out the window outside, we could see bombings in the neighborhood, but we could also see crowds of people at the morgue, just outside the hospital grounds, waiting to collect the bodies of their loved ones, some of them already carrying shrouded people in the direction of the cemetery nearby. And I went through the hallway to the main theater that was on that same floor as where we stayed and slept, and I held the door open for a family that was coming out of the operating room, and they were carrying their family member with their face and their body covered on a stretcher. And my eyes met the eyes of one of the women in that group. And as I saw her eyes with tears, I knew that mine were filling up too. And before I even got into the operating room, I passed another person's dead body on a stretcher in the hallway. Another person that the team in the night had not been able to save. They told me that patients were discharging themselves from the hospital, that some staff were too afraid to come to work. And we could hear that the artillery and the machine gun fire sounded closer. We were surrounded by evacuation zones, and the hospital itself was in this red zone at the top of this picture. People were asking us if we, as foreigners, were party to any more information than they were party to. They said, "Do you know anything? And are you evacuating?" And I thought to myself, it is like being in European Gaza Hospital in April all over again, except it's worse. There are more attacks, there are more wounded people, and there are no other functional hospitals. And really calling our own hospitals, as Mohammed alluded to, calling our own hospital functional was a real stretch. At the point when I arrived, Nasser Hospital had 630 admitted patients. And that was a facility that was meant to have 340 beds. It was the third day that week that we'd had no water in one of the operating rooms. You can even see here, even if those taps were working, one of them, the handle, is unable to be repaired. And so when the water's running, they're down to one. But on this day without water, the nurses are pouring from a little bottle onto the arms of the surgeons and the other staff as they scrub in. We had a day where we had no air conditioning because we were so low on generator fuel. And the surgeons and the nurses, we were sweating into the wounds of the patients as we worked. That morning, the CT scanner was down. We didn't know if it would be able to be fixed. It was, but even being out of commission for a short time is catastrophic. There's so many penetrative injuries to the head, the thorax, abdomen, that it's essential to have imaging to make your diagnosis and make your surgical plan. So I joined the team in the operating room, and the first patient of the day was a boy about 12 years old with a nerve injury. And somehow these little bits of shrapnel always seem to find the nerves. One of the surgeons that day, Dr. Hassan, he said to me, if we did nothing but operate on peripheral nerve injuries, I think we would work for 3 years. And his colleague, Dr. Jamal, said to me, this boy lost all his family. And when he said the name, I realized that I actually already knew the story because they were the cousins of one of my friends. And I had been in Gaza when their home was bombed in Khan Younis, in Abasan al-Khabira. The whole family had been killed, save for 2 survivors. Dr. Ayman Abu Tayyar, who was the head of the nutrition department in Nasser Hospital, and one of his sons. And then in late June, Dr. Ayman had announced the shortage of baby formula at Nasser Hospital. And a few days later, he was dead. The tent where he stayed with his family was bombed in the Al-Mawasi area. His niece was killed, along with another child from the family, but his son survived. Dina was one of the nurses on duty that day. And if you look closely, we both look absolutely exhausted here. And for her, part of that exhaustion was because alongside her regular hospital shifts, she was taking care of her daughter, her 4 small nieces, and her sister-in-law, who had all been injured less than 10 days before when her own family's tent was bombed. And she was trying to mourn her brother Hamada, a journalist who was killed in that attack. The second patient of the day was 87 years old with a hip fracture, something so common to all of us orthopedic surgeons in Canada. And I can't imagine what suffering he has seen in his 87 years, but also how much indignity he has been subjected to in the last 2 years of his life. An elderly man forced to live an impossibly difficult condition. And in this picture, you see the two elderly men climbing the stairs, but maybe you don't initially notice the elderly man carried over a shoulder by his son, who's wearing a belt around his waist that suggests to me that this was habit, this was the norm, this was the only way that this old man could get around. I found a video in my saved photos from this morning, and I didn't put it in the presentation because in the video the patient starts to scream. Because although we had anesthetic, we did not always have analgesic. And so when we were able to sedate and do general anesthesia for patients in the operating room, they often awoke in the recovery room in terrible, terrible pain. I operated on a femur fracture with Dr. Wissam, who's in this photo with me. The man was about 25, and he had been injured in a bombing 3 days before. A blood vessel was cut in his arm, his spleen was injured, he had multiple holes in his intestine, and he had an open femur fracture. And there were 3 small wounds from shrapnel, each one about 1 centimeter. But inside, you wouldn't imagine how big the cavity and how dirty the injury of war can be on the inside of a body when the outside looks so innocuous. And I tried, but I can't find any good photos of Dr. Wissam, despite the fact that we worked together so much. Maybe that's why, because we were always working together and I never had my phone out. During the past year, he always used to pick up the Friday shifts, which are the weekend shifts. And he told me once it was because he doesn't like seeing administrators and managers first thing in the morning. And it wasn't because he didn't like work, because he knew that I always tried to circumvent the normal protocol, and Friday should be emergency surgeries only, but somehow I'd usually have about 6 planned cases that I wanted to get through each day. And Wissam was a brilliant surgical partner. We worked together very well, and he never said no to extra work. That day, though, he was debating if he should finish his shift at the hospital or if he should go home to his wife and their baby daughter in Deir al-Balah. And at that stage, he had actually never been evacuated before, never forced from his house, one of the only people in Gaza who could have said that. But he too saw the Israeli forces approaching onto the hospital. He felt this tension in the air, and he wondered, should he stay or should he go? And I said, do whatever you need to do. I'll stay with the junior residents. And as for that patient, the next day we had no choice but to amputate his leg because the blood stopped flowing to his foot and it started to rot attached to his body. This is Mustafa, one of the anesthesia technicians. And it was the first day that we'd seen each other since I'd been back in Gaza. And I noted that he looked tired, less positive. But he still gave me a tour around the periphery of the operating room, and he showed me where there were the windows to the outside, where the best eSIM signal could be found and the nicest breeze. And then I suggested that maybe we should go back into the depths of the hospital where we had a few more walls between us and the outside. Around noon, I took a moment outside the operating room for some rest and a snack, and that was when it started to get worse. More artillery fire, more machine guns. And our local colleagues said, don't walk between the buildings of the hospital, it's too unsafe. And I was the team leader for my NGO, and so part of my job was keeping in contact with our security advisors. So I spent the next few hours outside the operating room, checking on what was happening, trying to understand a bit better the situation, to see what the different possibilities were and what we would do in each situation. The Israeli authorities had announced that this operation, which always irks me that a word that I use to talk about saving lives is used to talk about ending them. They said this operation would be over at 3:30, but at 4:30 the explosions were as heavy as ever. As I sat there checking in with colleagues, I looked at some of the news and what people were talking about online. The long-term news, which described concentration camps in Gaza, was as terrible as usual. The neighborhood news and the closeness of the tanks was completely alarming. One of my colleagues globally was writing about the lack of international attention in Sudan. And the local staff were texting about the fact that the price of flour had gone up yet again. Despite how abnormal all of these things are, there was an extent to which life had gone on around the hospital as normal. And I mean normal by the unacceptable things that had become daily occurrences, like little girls lining up to collect fresh water to carry home to their tents, the tent camps and the school shelters that were right beside the hospital. A colleague of mine who was in one of the other buildings wrote about another tragedy. Her patient had lost a pregnancy at 19 weeks, and it was one of so many miscarriages and pregnancy losses that she was seeing that related to malnutrition and stress and infections. And I called my mother, not to tell her that we were okay, but to tell her that we would keep going. Then I went back to the operating room, and I assisted one of the vascular surgeons with an above-elbow amputation. This is catastrophic for a patient. This is completely debilitating, but there was no other choice. He was a young man, and a few days before, he had gone to try to get food. And he went to what people call the American Food Station, the American Aid, which means the Gaza Humanitarian Foundation, which is an organization that distributes food, and where all too often my patients came with gunshot wounds from trying to collect food for their starving families. This man had a small injury on the back of his arm, and the front of his arm, the upper half of his arm was just completely blown out. It was hard to imagine that the vascular surgeons had ever managed to restore blood flow on the first day. But like so many patients that we saw, they restored blood flow temporarily, then it clotted off again. We didn't have the capacity to observe any of these patients as closely as we should have. They were so much more prone to infection. We didn't have enough anticoagulants. And so many times, vascular surgery would save a limb one day, and then a couple of days later, we'd cut it off. I can't count how many patients that I saw who were shot at the GHF. Some of them didn't even know what had happened to them because there was such chaos at the scene. But the ones that knew what had happened to them told me that they were shot by Israeli soldiers as they tried to collect food. In another one of the operating theaters, the general surgeons had a 2-year-old girl on the table. All of her intestines were out of her belly, and I asked if it was an explosion. And they said no, it was a gunshot. This is Dr. Asil, one of the general surgeons, scrubbing in and putting on gloves while at the same time checking over the note that her medical student had written and giving her advice on what to add. All of the teams, we had so many more patients than we could deal with, and medical students in Gaza were filling such a large role, so much larger than they should ever have had to, whilst trying to still follow their classes. And then in the early evening, an Israeli drone, a quadcopter, entered the hospital complex, and it shot a man just outside the administration building. It paralyzed him from the chest down. Another man was shot in the head. I was worried about everybody, but I also had a personal responsibility, and one of my international teammates was still in a different building of the hospital complex. He was eventually going to have to leave that building and come back to the main building, or I was going to have to tell him that he needed to stay there overnight. He needed to sleep there and not move between the buildings. But I had no idea if it was going to get better or if it was going to get worse. Around sunset, some of the local staff checked the area, and then they brought my teammates back to the main hospital. And in the next days, some of these movements, they were almost comical, that we, these privileged international staff, would be coddled and rushed from one building to the next, people telling us, don't dawdle, go fast. And on either side of us, people were living in those areas. They were sleeping on blankets in the streets. They couldn't even dream of the kind of protection that we had just to be inside the four walls of a hospital. And in the meantime, I kept on working in the operating room because checking the news and worrying was not helping anyone, and in particular, it was not helping myself. And I find when I'm operating, nothing else exists. And that's true whether I'm here in Canada or whether I'm in Gaza or somewhere else. And it is both a blessing and a curse. But sometimes it lets me hide from the greater horrific reality by treating the individual tragedies. And in this case, it was a young man who was brought in with a humerus fracture and another vascular injury, this time from an explosion. And so the young junior resident and I put on an X-fix together. That's the mainstay of orthopedic surgery in a war zone, putting pins into bones and hooking them up with bars outside the body, because to do anything more is just to invite infection. Dr. Sahel was the resident that I was working with, and some of you will have heard me talk about him before. He was one of the first two residents that I met in October when I went to Gaza during my first time during the genocide. And Dr. Sahel was known to his colleagues as somebody who had infinite love for his little daughters, always had a story for them, always had another photo to show his resident friends. And it became a little running joke that Sahel always had a picture of the little girls on his phone that he was always wanting to show other people. And so this is his little Asma on what was her first day of kindergarten in a neighboring tent around last December. But just before I arrived in Gaza in July, I saw this terrible string of text messages on the European Gaza Hospital group chat that Sohail and his family had been injured. And I wrote to him, hoping that the injuries were not so bad that he wouldn't be able to write back. He did respond to me. He wrote, "Our tent was directly targeted and all of us sustained injuries." So when I saw him on the 10th of July, that was his first shift back since his family had been injured in this bombing. And this photo is from last fall. The Sohail I saw in July was noticeably thinner and seemed to have lost all his color. Their baby, Mariam, was hit with shrapnel in the thigh. Asma was hit with shrapnel in the head. Sohail's father had a broken femur. And he showed me the video that someone at the hospital had taken when they arrived in, and he told me, "My wife's strength in that terrifying moment was truly remarkable. Despite the chaos and the fear, she held herself together for the sake of our daughters. Her courage reminded me what it means to be truly selfless. I will never forget the bravery she showed that night." Thankfully for the little girls, for Sohail and his wife, the injuries, at least physically, were fairly minor. But again, one more family bombed in tents. Then I went into the theater again and I did an above-knee amputation in a 19-year-old who was another victim of the GHF food trap. Shot through the artery, the repair failed. And I was lamenting having to cut off the leg of a 19-year-old. And the doctor I was working with looked at me and he said, "We're not the ones that did this to him." That was Dr. Dawood, and it was the first time I've ever met him because he was a doctor from Al-Shifa. You remember that Al-Shifa was besieged and largely destroyed in the spring of 2024, but Palestinians rebuild even when destruction is still ongoing. And it was something that I saw in 2019 and 2021, and I would watch people sweeping rubble in the street, and I would wonder, why not wait until the attacks are over? But of course, that's the naive hope of an inexperienced person. It's not what Palestinians have lived through. They know that they need to rebuild as they go. So Al-Shifa Hospital, as of May, had actually 3 functioning operating room theaters and an emergency room that had been reopened. but it was nothing compared to the 22 specialized theaters that they used to have. And they had no fuel for their generators. So the only parts of that hospital that had any kind of electricity were the operating rooms and the ICU. And Dawood and some other surgeons had been shifted away from Al-Shifa Hospital because the resources there were so limited that they could not work. So he had come to Nasser Hospital to support the staff there. He told me that at Al-Shifa Hospital, the only surgeries done are life and limb-saving ones. He says they don't have the capacity to do any follow-up treatment. And he said to me, anyone who gets an infection just gets sepsis and dies. And now, in retrospect, I look back at that day, that first patient whose femur Dr. Wissam and I fixed, the 25-year-old man with the explosive injury. We amputated his leg the next day, and the 2 days after that, he got abdominal sepsis, and he got a devastating infection, and he died. And I wrote in my journal, which is also an email that I send to family and friends and close colleagues, I wrote this that night. I said, my God, remember this used to be a place with an extremely strained but functional health system. This sort of thing would have been absolutely unheard of years ago. Patients would have had a full workup, interventions, follow-up treatment. The evacuation list for complex cases is still 10,000 and some patients long. But everybody needs treatment that can't be provided here and right now, whether it's surgery or chemotherapy or vitamins or just enough calories and nutrients to eat, or just the chance to stay out of a bullet's path or a missile's trajectory. It was after 11 when we were finishing that case, and we had finished the work that we'd set out for ourselves that day, as well as the emergency cases that had arrived so far. And so I grabbed some packages of instant coffee and some cookies that I brought with me, and I gave them to Dr. Wissam, and I asked him to share them with the other doctors on call. And when I brought it, I figured that at least a little bit of the sugar and the fat that was mixed in would do them good. These residents that were working such long hours with so little food. And it broke my heart how significant this was for them. They would all thank me, and they would usually take photos of the cup of coffee and what they were doing when they drank it. Wissam told me that day that he split his package in half so that he could drink coffee on 2 consecutive mornings. And he took his cookies home, and he and his wife mixed them with a little bit of water and gave them to their daughter, Celine, who's just 1 year old and has never known anything but genocide. It was the first time that she'd had anything sweet like that, and he took a video of her laughing and clapping in happiness for this small treat that her father had been able to bring her. So it was midnight when I got back to our dorms, and my colleagues told me that the drones were flying so close at that point that the electronics were reacting to it. And I thought I would go to bed, but then I checked my phone and I saw that a German journalist had texted me, and he and I had had a 9 p.m. appointment, but I'd been stuck in the operating room, so I'd missed it. And I explained to him that it had been a crazy day. And he texted back, were there unexpected patients? And I thought, I'm an orthopedic surgeon on trauma call. In Canada, there are unexpected patients. But of course there were, and even more so than that, nobody expects to be bombed in their tent. Nobody expects to be shot while trying to get food. Nobody expects that they will have a preventable complication of surgery because of a healthcare system that has been systematically destroyed and besieged. And so he asked me if we should try the next day, if the next day would be any better. And I said, let's just do it now. This is important. Because as Mohammed said, there are no international journalists in Gaza. And Palestinian journalists are automatically regarded by a biased world to be unreliable witnesses of their own decimation. And so alongside everything else that international medical volunteers are doing in Gaza, we are asked to take on that role that would normally be done by foreign correspondents for journalism agencies. So I told the journalist we might as well talk now. And I asked him if he could hear the gunshots and the missiles as we talked. And the next day was actually worse. One of my colleagues shook me awake at 5:30 in the morning. She said that there had been heavy attacks all night, but I'd slept through them. She'd been lying awake in her bed, and she'd seen that Nasser Hospital was trending online. Hashtag all eyes on Nasser. She found a statement that was written online by Mohammed Sakar, the head of the nursing department, who very often came to sit on our balcony to pray with some of the international staff, to visit and to chat. And he is a man who is not prone to exaggeration. He's writing from the perspective of somebody who has lived through hospital attacks, who has seen hospital invasion. His colleagues have been taken prisoner, taken hostage. I'm not sure if he himself was also taken or not. And it's difficult to read this message now, but imagine reading it when you're there in the same building as it was written. Do not call us heroes. Just tell them we understood what it truly means to be human. It was a blessing to know you all. Forgive us. We are not numbers. On behalf of the staff of the medical complex in Gaza. We decided to stay and keep working. And one of my colleagues texted me inevitably to wonder, would the international staff evacuate? Would we leave them in what most of our local staff felt was a more vulnerable position, to be in a hospital without international presence? Dr. Wissam worked another 8 hours and then finally went home. And the residents who had come in the morning and I kept working together. Because when you are at a hospital that might be attacked, there are only two choices. You leave and you go to your family, or you stay and you just keep right on treating patients. And you act as if the situation is normal, even though it's anything but normal. You bury yourself in work and you do what you can to help the people around you. And I think that is what you do when you're in a hospital that might be attacked. But it is not what we do from out here when another hospital that we're not inside might be attacked, or it shouldn't be. As we've seen with the massive silence of healthcare professionals and medical communities for the last 2 years, that actually has been how many people have reacted to healthcare institutions under attack. Business as usual. But it's not how we can continue to respond, not unless we want to live in a world where healthcare facilities are allowed to be a legitimate military target. Attacks on healthcare facilities are prohibited by international law, and yet in the last few years, there has been a steep rise in attacks on hospitals, healthcare providers, ambulances, and clinics. It's not just in Gaza, although that in Palestine is the most severe example of all of these, with 1,300 attacks in 2024, which is more than have been ever documented in any other country. It's happening in Sudan, in the DRC, in Ukraine, in Myanmar, in Afghanistan, and in other countries around the world. Healthcare facilities should be protected by international humanitarian law, and the destruction that has been wrought on Gaza's healthcare system and on its people by 2 years of incessant military attacks will be felt into the next generations of Palestinians, even if we stop it today. And that tolerance that we seem to have developed for violence against healthcare systems, that will affect the whole world. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Deirdre. So for the next part of our event, I just wanted to introduce Professor Naomi Klein. We're going to be having a panel discussion here. So just a quick introduction to Professor Klein. So she is an internationally known author, social activist, and she's the co-director for the Center for Climate Justice. And she is a vocal supporter of Palestinian rights and social justice. And it's our pleasure to have her here. So what we're going to be doing for the next part is I'll be asking some questions to the both of them. I just want to make sure that this PowerPoint is, are we able to switch the PowerPoint over? Perfect. Okay, so we're going to be able to take some questions from the audience as well. So if you guys want to ask questions, if you go to slido.com and type in this meeting number, then that will bring you to a chat box, and then you can ask your questions there. And then we'll select a couple of questions. We probably won't be able to get through all of them. And then we'll give a chance for our panelists to answer the questions. So I wanted to start first with Professor Klein. I just wanted to ask about what are your responses listening to Deirdre as somebody who is a part of Jewish Voices for Peace and the Jewish Faculty Network. Just wanted to hear your thoughts on this, please.
So first, I want to thank you, Dr. Sultan, for and your organization, BC Physicians Against Genocide. It is truly shocking that every single physician in British Columbia is not against genocide. Thank you so much for convening us and all of the groups that came together to make this possible. And I, of course, want to thank Dr. Nunan. I want to thank you for the life of principle you're leading, for the risks you're taking, and of course that extends to all of the other courageous healthcare workers who have traveled to Gaza during Israel's ongoing genocide, and especially to those Palestinian doctors, nurses, and paramedics who never left and who are themselves and their families the targets of genocidal violence and starvation. So my first response to what we have heard is really not as somebody who's active in specifically Jewish organizing, but rather as a human being. It's clear that a chasm has opened up in the moral universe, and unless that chasm is closed, and that would take real consequences for the perpetrators and real justice and reparations for the victims, then that chasm will continue to widen, as we just heard, continue to expand until it swallows more and more of the hard-won, agreed-upon standards for minimum human decency. That is the way that impunity works. It doesn't stay in one place. It isn't stable. It spreads, kind of like an oil slick, poisoning everything in its path. Dr. Nunan talked about, I heard you on CBC radio this morning, talking about living up to the promises that you made to colleagues and patients in Gaza to tell their stories when you got home. And that is a sacred pact, and I want to thank you for honoring it on top of everything else that you have done. But we too are bound by sacred pacts. Israel's genocide is a crime against Palestinians as a people. That's what genocide is. It is also a crime against humanity, which means that it calls on each of us to respond as human beings in defense of our shared humanity. That is the whole point of codifying crimes under international law. It is a pact between all of us. It's a promise to act. At the same time, our different identities and our different positions in societies mean that we have different roles to play and we're impacted differently. In Jewish Voice for Peace, which I've been active in for almost 2 decades now, and in IJV here in Canada, I think we have a particular role to play in countering the dangerous claim that Israel's violence is about keeping Jews as a people safe. The claim that everything that Israel has done since October 7th has been about preventing a second Holocaust. We've all heard these claims. That's Israel's defense, in fact, at the ICJ against South Africa's charge of genocide. Israel claimed that it was defending itself against an attempted genocide, so therefore couldn't be committing genocide. Because these claims are made not only in the name of Israelis, but in the name of Jews as a people, those of us who are Jewish have a particular role to play in disrupting and disputing this false narrative, in standing up to the many ways that the Nazi genocide and the legacies of deep trauma that it left have been weaponized in order to rationalize a genocide in the present day. We have that role to play. But we should all stand up to this. But for Jews, the role is to say, as we've said many times, not in our name. And it's to say that this is not, in fact, what was meant by never again. The Holocaust was also a crime against Jews, but it was a crime against humanity, and never again meant never again to anyone. Listening to Dr. Nunan's firsthand reports of this war waged on children, on infants, looking at those messages from her colleagues in Gaza, reporting on an epidemic of miscarriages and bodies so ravaged they cannot reproduce life, I'm also struck by another responsibility that many of us in these organizations feel as Jews, and that is to identify the ideology, the patterns of thought that create rationales and justifications for these atrocities, and that cast them as necessary. It's the reason many of us insist on speaking about Zionism, both Jewish Zionism and Christian Zionism, as well as the growing role of messianic belief systems in both Israel and the United States. These are apocalyptic beliefs that see the ethnic cleansing of Palestinians from their lands and their colonization by Jewish Israelis as somehow linked to the arrival or the return of the Messiah and the beginning of some kind of wondrous golden age, whether on earth or in heaven. They're having debates about that. I'm reminded the remarkable Palestinian-Canadian doctor Tarek Loubani recently posted a video about having been asked to address a group of emergency workers, healthcare workers, about the state of health or lack thereof in Gaza. And he was told, he was instructed, that while he could talk about the attacks on the healthcare system, he was not allowed to talk about who was doing the attacking. So that's not what we're going to do here today. We're going to talk about who is doing the attacking, and more than that, we're going to talk about the ideology behind those attacks that creates the rationale for those attacks. Of course, Tarek didn't listen to that. So, not all Zionists subscribe to extreme messianic beliefs. Some are secular. But these beliefs are becoming increasingly prevalent at the highest reaches of the government in both Israel and the United States. And even more secular forms of Zionism are shot through with a dangerous fixation on, and this is key, demographics, specifically on the need for Jewish Israelis to maintain a demographic majority within Israel, and for some within the entire territory that they refer to as Greater Israel, which includes the West Bank and Gaza, from the river to the sea, if you will. I believe that those of us at universities who study the interaction of ideas and world events, and that's a great many of us, have a particular duty to speak about these dangerous demographic-obsessed belief systems, despite the enormous pressures on us not to. And I say that for a simple reason. I don't think it's possible to understand the atrocities that we just heard about without at least trying to understand the belief systems that try to rationalize them. The people perpetrating this genocide, and many around the world who have offered it their active support, understand themselves to be fighting not only a military battle, not only a battle over security, despite what they may claim, but a demographic battle. The numbers are disputed, but there are roughly the same number of Israeli Jews as there are Palestinians living inside Israel, as well as the areas that Israel illegally occupies, East Jerusalem, the West Bank, and Gaza. By some counts, there are significantly more Palestinians than Israelis, in part because Palestinian birth rates exceed Jewish Israeli birth rates. And there certainly would be many more Palestinians if the internationally enshrined right of return were respected. So I know this because it is the subject of an obsessive focus in the Israeli media and among Israeli lawmakers. I don't have time to outline this in detail, but here are a few choice examples. In October 2022, 1 year before the October 7th attacks, a controversy erupted when a prominent Israeli doctor, head of cardiothoracic surgery at a medical center in Beersheba, was recorded complaining to a politician about the growth of, and this is a quote, the problematic population in Israel. He suggested that there should be a fine levied on the fifth child that emerged from what he called the Arab womb, and said, we have to figure something out. A year earlier, an Israeli professor and historian argued in Israel Hayom, which is the country's largest newspaper, that, quote, the demographic race between Jews and Arabs is at the heart of the national conflict in Israel. Our strategy has to be a demographic expansion and blocking Arab Muslim migration to Israel. The headline for the article was, quote, it's all about demography, stupid. Netanyahu himself has admitted, and has since the beginning, that Israel's illegal separation wall, which Palestinians call the apartheid wall, is not only about security and keeping Israel safe, which was its official rationale, it is also, he said, it is also designed to prevent, quote, demographic spillover of Palestinians from the West Bank into Israel, which would threaten Israel's demographic dominance. It is in this context that Gaza, because it is so densely populated, with a population of over 2 million people, was always seen by Israel as the greatest demographic threat to the guiding Zionist imperative to maintain a Jewish majority. Now, why am I going on about this in an event about attacks on hospitals, healthcare workers, patients, and the ability of Palestinians to reproduce life? Because it is the only thing that can make sense of the pattern behind Israel's atrocities. The relentless attacks on healthcare infrastructure, as we heard, 18 hospitals destroyed. The attacks on ambulances, on paramedics, on doctors while they sleep in tents. The sniper bullets piercing children's bodies and their skulls. The soldiers playing with children's toys. It's the only thing that can make sense of the blockade on baby formula. Tarek Labani, who just left Gaza, described smuggling baby formula into Gaza as if it were cocaine. What kind of mindset would lead to such a state of affairs? Only a mentality laser-focused on so-called demographic threats. Only a mentality that counts Palestinian babies and compares them with Israeli babies and panics. It's long past time to state clearly that the whole language of demographic threats is what has taken us to this place. Because babies aren't threats. Babies are never threats. When you normalize a discourse that imagines that they are, it is not far off to the kinds of atrocities we have been hearing about today. So what I think of when I listen to Dr. Nunan is that these attacks on children, on babies, on women, on hospitals, is that this is a war on Palestinian life and life-making. And it is not happening by accident. It's happening because political Zionism has as its goal the maintenance of a Jewish majority in a Jewish ethno-state. That's how Palestinian life came to be viewed as a threat in and of itself. That's the root cause of the dehumanization. Almost 2 years into this genocide, no one who claims that this is Israel exerting its right to defend itself after the horrific October 7th attacks should be taken seriously. This supremacist demographic thinking has been a bomb waiting to explode. October 7th lit the fuse. As we are all well aware, there are many people who would like us not to speak about this, who push universities to pass definitions of anti-Semitism that would ban what I just said. And I know that many people are made uncomfortable by it because they grew up with a very different story of Zionism, a story about safety and pride after unfathomable slaughter. I grew up in that story, so I understand the discomfort well. At the same time, we cannot give in to this pressure telling us that we cannot speak of actually existing Zionism, because nothing else can explain how we ended up here, and without understanding it, we can't stop it. Thank you.
Question from the audience for Deirdre. Can you help us understand the state of the famine in Gaza? I understand that some areas face starvation and others do not. What did you see?
So what I saw and what is happening now are spaced out by several weeks. So what I saw in Gaza, in Khan Younis, I was in the south. I came briefly through Deir al-Balah, which is a less physically destroyed area, but we drove through markets where I saw next to no food in any stall. I ate the same meals that were being provided to staff at that hospital, and it was not enough to sustain life. It was a simple plate of rice, sometimes with a few bits of canned vegetable in it. They were given one meal a day if they worked a 24-hour shift. They were not given a meal if they worked an 8-hour shift. And these were the privileged few that were getting a cooked meal from the World Central Kitchen. Even that supply dried up in the last couple of days that it was in Gaza. And so at that time, the famine was near complete at that point. But the access to food was it just was non-existent. Some of my previous colleagues from years past who worked with Doctors Without Borders, they had good income, they had savings. They said they were eating once every 2 days, not because they couldn't afford food, but because they could not find food to buy. So this was at the lowest point, the most dire point, where really it was basically only the GHM where food was available, or the scant number of World Food Program trucks which were coming in, and which people in their desperation were meeting at the border, unloading themselves, getting shot by snipers and tank fire, sometimes getting run over by the truck, sometimes both of the above in a single person. What's happening now is that commercial trucks are being let into Gaza. So despite all of this narrative that we heard that it was impossible to deliver food to Gaza, despite the Canadian government believing this to the extent that they funded airdrops into a place that you can drive a truck into, within a few days of the Canadian airdrops, there were foods like chocolate and cappuccino powder and chips that were being brought in and sold for a profit to people who had been intentionally starved. And so what we see now is a bit of a continuation of this. There are more aid trucks coming in than there had been, but there is this ridiculous non-nutritious food. Thank goodness it at least has some calories, but it really doesn't have nutritional value. It's not what starving people need. The UN has just released a market report. And if whoever's asked this question can catch me afterwards, I can send it to you because it's very elucidating. I got it last night.
Question for Naomi. How does your work with the Center of Climate Justice intersect with the genocide that's happening in Gaza?
So climate justice is really about the intersection of human rights and the climate crisis, right? It is based on the recognition that this climate breakdown doesn't affect people equally, that it traces the pre-existing fault lines and people whose lives are already being discounted or deemed, sacrificable are the people who are suffering first and worst in the face of climate change. My wake-up call was Hurricane Katrina. I covered it 20 years ago, and that was such a stark, before that I was somebody who was much more focused on economic justice, social justice. I wasn't really focused on the environment, but what I saw in New Orleans, which impacted that city so unequally. If you were, if you had money, that overwhelmingly meant if you were white, you could get in a car and get out. If you needed there to be a functioning state, and that overwhelmingly impacted poor and black people in the city, you were left on the roof of hospitals saying help, and help didn't arrive, right? So human rights and climate justice are, it's part of the same movement, really, and that's why I think, Greta Thunberg, along with 350 other people right now, are on a flotilla that has just, I think, left Tunis, headed for Gaza, because these are the same issues. There is also an ecocide within the genocide. I mean, this is the attack on the forced starvation also plays out in attacks on Palestinian farms in Gaza, systematic attacks on the ability to grow food. There's a terraforming going on. A lot of what Israeli soldiers do in Gaza is, not fight at this point. It's bulldoze and detonate existing Palestinian infrastructure and homes. And one of the most telling details is that it isn't only bulldozers that are in there now. It's construction equipment that turns rubble into gravel, that breaks it down and literally turns it to dust. Trump calls it a demolition zone, and it really is. So it is this kind of, there's an ecological side to this. There's also a climate impact side, and the military is one of the biggest emitters of greenhouse gas emissions. And I think that there was a study that was done that just in the first 2 months, the amount of fossil fuels that were emitted was equivalent to burning at least 150,000 tons of coal. But nobody is against the genocide because it's bad for the environment. You're against the genocide because it's a genocide. That said, I think one of the most prescient reactions very early in this horrific chapter was from Gustavo Petro, who's the president of Colombia, who, in the early days of the genocide, responding to the intent to commit genocide that was being expressed by Israeli leaders, he said, this is global 1933. And then he explained that the world's poor in the global south sees their future in Gaza in the context of climate change and in the context of the increased fortressing of borders, right? And he was saying, this is the future that we see. And as Deirdre was saying, it won't stop. If this impunity is allowed to continue, it won't stop. And we're already seeing that. Rula Jabrial, the Palestinian journalist, says, Gaza will either be the red line or it will become the global paradigm. And I think we've just seen some evidence of that with the US attack on that ship in international waters, that Venezuelan boat, which it claimed, it had a right to blow up because they were drug traffickers, provided no evidence of this. It doesn't have that right in international waters, and it turns out that many of them may have been migrants, right? So we've gone from just kind of allowing migrants to drown in international waters, right, or not rescuing, to actively attacking. And I think that that's what Gustavo Petro saw. These attacks on international law are also really connected to our hopes of responding to the climate crisis, because climate action relies on multilateralism, right? All of it, the infrastructure of the UN summits that happen year after year happen within the context of a functioning UN, right? I mean, functioning in air quotes. All of these multilateral organizations of scientists, I mean, it's all reliant on there being something called international law. And I don't think we should make any mistake that that is what is in the crosshairs right now.
Question for Deirdre. How do we respond to the Israeli position that hospitals are being targeted because they are Hamas infrastructure?
So I think there are various ways to approach this. One way is to look at what sort of intent is being expressed by Israeli officials, public figures in the Israeli media. We get a very sanitized quotation here that usually when we have our balanced reporting that gives the Israeli side, it's a denialism. If you go and look into the Israeli media, there's a Guardian article by a Palestinian British journalist, Arwa Mahdawi, where she quotes 20 examples of genocidal statements that have been printed in Israeli media, and additional examples from Channel 14 News. So there are plenty of people in influential and decision-making positions in Israel that are not even looking for the excuse of Hamas in a hospital. They're just stating that their intent is to wipe out Palestinians and to destroy the healthcare system. So there's one angle that while we keep on providing this sort of Hamas explanation at the request of some Israeli voices, that's not necessarily needed. Number two is to go to international law. Hospitals are a protected space. Healthcare is a protected space. If there is the presence of a military threat that could cause harm to the enemy inside a hospital, it's just not suddenly a green light to go ahead and flatten the whole hospital and everybody inside it. There are limitations. And so these limitations include the requirement to provide a warning. It's the limitation to be proportional. So whatever damage is done to this healthcare structure needs to somehow be proportional to the risk that's posed by what is supposedly being done in it that is a danger to the enemy. And that risk has to be considered not just in the short term, but also in the long term. What is the long-term consequence of taking a healthcare institution out of commission, of damaging it? Patients always need to be protected. They should be evacuated. And once evacuated, there should be provisions made for their ongoing healthcare. So if we take a little microcosm of this August 25th attack on Nasser Hospital that happened. So there was an attack on a functioning hospital with zero warning, zero evacuation allowed. There was an attack on a hospital that we were then told initially was a mistake. Then we were told that it was intentional. We were told that it was to kill terrorists. And then we were told that it was to take out a camera. But there were 4 separate missiles, if you look at the analysis of the video, 3 of which were fired at exactly the same part of the hospital. What kind of a camera is that takes that many missiles to destroy it? And why did we not question, did our media not question this double tap strike, which is well acknowledged to be a mechanism by which aid workers and civilians are targeted, and even the protected initial wounded, that even if a combatant was targeted in the initial strike of a double tap strike, that wounded combatant is then out of combat and they become a protected citizen. So there are a lot of ways to look at it, and those ways don't lead to justifying every single hospital attack that has happened.
So a question for both of you is, what are some meaningful actions that we can actually take to help?
Are you sure? You don't? Okay. Well, there's a lot we can do. And first I want to acknowledge it's clear that people want to do more, right? I mean, even just the interest in tonight's event was quite something. I mean, we were originally booked in a room at the Allard Law School that held 200, and it sold out immediately. It would have been nice to have it at the law school for various reasons, but we decided to. I think lawyers also, as well as doctors. Maybe next time in the medical school. But we moved to this room that is twice the size and filled that to capacity. There's hundreds more listening online. So it's good to have you with us, and I think it really reflects a desire to do something and to figure out how to take meaningful action. And there are a bunch of things that we can do. I would say, for those of you who haven't already, I would really encourage you to read Francesca Albanese's report, most recent report called "From the Economy of Occupation to the Economy of Genocide," where she really dissects the companies that are profiting most from the mechanics of settler colonialism, of the economy of displacement and replacement of the Palestinian population. So it's everything from the weapons companies to the surveillance to the real estate companies, and she includes universities as well. So read that report. It's a great tool to think about having the most impact for BDS strategies, for boycott and divestment. You know, the BDS Central Committee has always been really clear that it's important to settle on a few really high impact targets rather than be really diffuse, because you're going to lessen your impact, right? So I think that the report is a really good place to start in thinking about where some of the highest impact, where some of the most high impact could be. It's also worth remembering that boycotts and divestment are only part of BDS. The last is S, that's sanctions, right? And the focus for 20 years now has been on boycott and divestment and less on sanction, because there really wasn't the political possibility of governments beginning to sanction. It's really only governments who can sanction. While boycotts and divestment are things that we can do as individuals, but more importantly, as organizations, as universities, as pension funds, and so on. But it's governments that can impose sanctions on military trade, on other forms of trade. And that is starting to shift, and we need to keep the pressure up. I was really struck that, quite a few senators signed on to this Block the Bombs bill in the United States. There was even a very middle of the road senator from Maine named Angus Reid. He is very much a centrist. He's no Bernie Sanders. He's a longtime supporter of Israel. And in July, with the same period that Deirdre was there, he, faced with these facts around starvation, he said, "I am through supporting the actions of the current Israeli government and will advocate and vote for an end to any United States support whatsoever until there is a demonstrable change in the direction of Israeli policy." And that's what we should be moving towards. That is an appropriate response to genocide, right? It isn't only military exports. It is exerting maximum pressure on a rogue state. That's the way we need to think about it. Now, in Canada, we have claimed that we are not shipping weapons to Israel, but there's a very large loophole, which is that we can ship weapons to the United States, which can then ship weapons to Israel. So one very concrete thing that we can do right now is support a private members bill that's been introduced by Jenny Kwan, called the No More Loopholes Bill, appropriately, and it's a new bill, and you can call your MP and get them to back it. Why wouldn't they back it, right? And so if you want to do that, you can go to the website for Canadians for Justice and Peace in the Middle East, which is cjpme.org. Something else that we can do in pressuring Ottawa is, you remember all the Ukrainians who came to Canada to escape fighting? There was a lot of family reunification. It was a very successful program. There have been promises made, commitments made to do something similar on a smaller scale, temporary visas for Palestinians in Gaza who have family in Canada to reunite. So this program exists, but it is not being implemented. The Liberals are doing next to nothing to evacuate Palestinians from Gaza, like get them out of harm's way, which is what these programs are about. It's what it was about in Ukraine. It's what it should be about in Gaza. And instead they're saying we can't get them out because we have to check their biometrics to make sure they're not security risks, and we don't have biometric capacity in Gaza. So this thing is a cruel taunt, and we need to demand that they open a humanitarian corridor. Other countries have managed to do it. France has managed to do it. Canada isn't even trying. So we need to put this kind of pressure now on a Liberal government that doesn't have a majority, so they have to listen to people a little bit, just a tiny bit. So do that. We can't do this alone, right? There are lots of groups. We're here at UBC. I know not everybody here is part of the UBC community, but if you are, you could join Divest UBC if you're a student. You could join Faculty for Palestine if you're on faculty. You could join staff for Palestine. You could join Jewish Faculty Network if you're Jewish. So there's lots of organizations, and it's really important not to try to do it yourself. I wanted to share a quote that I just read a couple of days ago from the Irish writer Jack Sheehan, who said, "If we were to do nothing useful for the rest of our days, save to hasten the arrival of a free and democratic Palestine with equal rights for all, ours would be lives worth living."
We have QR codes that are up around the auditorium as well, and then another QR code on a subsequent slide here about actions that you can take, which include a petition for physicians and other healthcare workers. So if you're not one of those, share it with a doctor, nurse, dentist, psychiatrist, psychologist, et cetera, that you know. And then another QR code for actions, which will duplicate some of the same things that Naomi has already said, maybe with a few more details and links. And I don't have anything specific to add other than do it together, make connections with other people, and work to magnify each other's actions, inspire each other, help each other get through the moments where it feels like all the signatures in the world on all the petitions on the internet don't do anything, because I know how hard it is to be here in Canada and very far away from what feels like any sort of meaningful action, but still, this is where real change can take place.
Question for Professor Klein. Is the tide turning, examples of which are larger flotilla, Spain's sanctions, Burnaby's apartheid-free pledge, and Piers Morgan's change of tune?
I mean, I definitely think there's been a sea change in public opinion, and that's why I think that there's a whole new wave of people who want to get involved and want, who are maybe, haven't been at all the protests and haven't been part of this lead up, and there need to be these, accessible on-ramps for people and like a really large umbrella to exert that sort of maximum pressure. And so I think there is a change in public opinion, and I think there are still places where that matters. And I think, frankly, under Carney, Canada should be one of them. And, a lot of people voted Liberal for the first time because they didn't want Poilievre, but we're ending up with a pretty authoritarian government. And we shouldn't sleepwalk into this because we actually do have power, right? So it's, this is true around C2, this really draconian immigration bill that they want to introduce. So I think that people who voted this government in need to say, hey, I want my money back. This is not what we thought we were getting. So, and then there are places that feel pretty far gone. I mean, it seems that it's not clear to me that public opinion is going to shift the Trump administration, even though public opinion, including within the Republican Party, is shifting very dramatically, right? When you have people like Tucker Carlson and Marjorie Taylor Greene speaking out against the genocide, that's pretty big. But the whole point of being an authoritarian regime is you don't have to listen to public opinion. I mean, they're making that pretty clear. So I don't think that, I think we should use what leverage we still have here in Canada to its maximum effect, which isn't to say that they have no chance in the US. They should try to, but we should try harder.
Just in the interest of time, I think we'll end it here. It's 8:30. Thank you to both of you guys. I do have a couple of slides at the end just with some more action items, so let me just go ahead. These are just our sponsors for tonight's event, so we just wanted to say a big thank you to everybody. As you can see, lots of organizations, including many departments at UBC, so well done, and thank you very much for sponsoring this event. Deirdre had briefly talked about this letter to the government. So this is open to all physicians and healthcare workers. We also have a couple of printouts outside. So please sign this letter. And we're basically pushing the government to discuss at the upcoming Liberal Caucus meeting to take back to the United Nations at their General Assembly to sort of circumvent so the Security Council, of course, can be vetoed by one member, which is always vetoed by the United States. There's Article 377, whereby you can, when you're in a deadlock in a veto, you can try and break that and try to get humanitarian aid and peacekeeping missions. So we want that to be a discussion point at the Liberal caucus. We want that to reach the Prime Minister and then make its way to the mission at the United Nations. So please sign this letter. The deadline is in just a couple of days, and it's open to all physicians and healthcare workers. This is our mailing list for BC Physicians Against Genocide, so you can click on this QR code here, again posted outside as well. Just a request, our organization, we are all volunteers who are doing this. If you're able to donate, that will help because there are lots of costs associated with the work that we do. If you're able to, please e-transfer any amount to BC PAG, that stands for Physicians Against Genocide, team at gmail.com, and that can help us to continue the advocacy work that we do. And finally, this is a QR code to action items and solidarity groups. There are lots of groups that are existing locally, please find something that works for you and try to join. As Naomi had said, we don't want to go at this alone, but there are lots of groups that we can join to be able to support them in whatever capacity that we're able to. And I just wanted to make a final plug for Dr. Tarek Lobani, who Naomi had mentioned a few times in her presentation. He'll be coming on the 20th of October, and he will basically be speaking about his recent experience in Gaza. So this is an event which is going to be co-sponsored with the Independent Jewish Voices and Ismailis for Palestine. Again, QR code there at the bottom. It would be great if you guys are able to attend and support this event. So that's it from us. Thank you guys very much, and we'll hang around.